Hello, I'm Allison Ellis, founder of Titano Media. Cleaning up the man-made disaster we still call education is as vitally important to you and your loved ones as it is to me. If it isn't for anyone watching, stay tuned. It might be in the next few minutes. I'm going to speak about factors in the failure of education that aren't typically discussed and how Mount Titano would like to work together with you and with schools, homeschools, colleges, universities, civic and military leaders, and with all lovers of leisure learning and culture to address the problems and thereby also fix many other problems plaguing our country. This is Mount Titano's first book release, Finding Our Words, Words That Made America. It is a collection of the most beautifully written and spoken speeches in American history, many almost entirely forgotten. A vital feature of the book is that with every speech, there is an introduction written by the person in America, I believe most qualified to write them, Tracy Lee Simmons. He has a long career in journalism, has a profound knowledge of U.S. history, and is the author of Climbing Parnassus, a book that is beloved in the classical education and homeschool movements. This is one of the best books for Americans of all ages to read as we approach our 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But first, the destruction. What is our biggest threat? It's not politics, it's not the economy, not geopolitical issues. It's education. And we need to clear up something that's been floating around. Education did not collapse with the lockdowns. The gift in the lockdowns was that the devastation wrought on education for the last 100 years was finally made painfully obvious to all. People think we need to get back to basics, which is, in a sense, it's true, but the basics themselves have been severely lacking for decades. Whatever else we do, we need to once again read superior books. Children must learn to read and communicate well, which they do not do now. Using Professor Anthony Esselin's phrase, too often children speak in sublingual grunts. Learning to read, write, and speak well will allow them to learn everything else they desire. And by the way, while we're on the subject of children reading, we must stop teaching English as if the words were hieroglyphs or emojis and teach phonics again. Phonics and a good dictionary is all children need to take off with reading on their own. Holistic reading, which is what the emoji reading is called, it only sounds like an interesting concept. Let's put that tired, broken down idea out to pasture. Children will never be able to read great books unless they learn phonics, period. Theodore Roosevelt said in a speech included in Finding Our Words that in other forms of government, the average citizen is almost negligible in determining the national greatness. But in our republic, success will depend on how the average citizen does his or her duty in the everyday affairs of life, and only next in the occasional crisis which calls for heroic virtues. There were 3 words in that quote of particular interest: duty, heroic, virtues. Those are some of the words we've lost. More on that coming up. Let's condense the timeline. This all started with the Industrial Revolution, and the last nail in the coffin of education was the release of all the devices that we can all use to our great advantage, but with the speed of light, they have become children's surrogate families, teachers, and community. It sure gives new meaning to leaving children to their own devices. There are obviously exceptions. I'm speaking in generalities, but it's generally the case. Instead of providing daily encounters with greatness to emulate, which we still do, by the way, with classical music instruction, we've spent decades teaching children to disdain faith, to despise their country, and the foul arts of self-loathing, but not to read. My own education consisted of 12 years of Catholic school, undergrad in Texas, and I studied in a Master of Liberal Arts program at Stanford when I started homeschooling. I'm grateful for that. I paid hard money for that, yet I never once heard the term classical education until I read Simmons's book, Climbing Parnassus, about 10 years ago. How is that even possible? It's like studying culinary arts for 2 decades and never having heard the word cuisine. It was climbing Parnassus more than 18 years of school that taught me how much I didn't know, what I wanted to know, and what I especially wanted to give to my child, which is why I left my rewarding career to homeschool. Best decision I ever made. I have learned over the last 15 years that for centuries, education had been a rich, enormous feast that we generally call classical education. And today, we've been like pigeons poking around on the ground on the little scraps and unidentifiable bits of food that fell off the table from that feast of centuries, and we're still calling it a feast. We're still paying a fortune for it, and we require legions of people to serve it. On the other side of the equation, we have diminished and ignored the great trade and service skills with which people can serve society and themselves. Further, there have always been periods, even in American history, where certain regions had a population that was not studying at all in what we call school. But in place of book smarts, they were unbelievably skilled, courageous, resilient. They were giants. I'm thinking of Daniel Boone here as an example. We have lost our basic survival skills, lost our trade skills, and our fine education. But we are still parading around with those expensive papers, proving that we learned a little and wasted a lot. If there's anyone who still doubts the extent of the destruction in education, I have spent 15 years studying what was taught in school before the 1900s. I've purchased countless books used in America in the 18 and 1700s, all the way back to what was taught and how it was taught, even in Mesopotamia and ancient Rome. Most high school students, let's change that. I think most adults today would struggle with some of the vocabulary and spelling in those elementary school books from even just the 18th century. Certainly, even the 19th. Something else that has furthered my understanding. I've had a front row seat to natural and man-made disasters for decades, and I've learned how it relates to education and how we can contribute to restoration. I spent a summer driving around Lebanon 14 years after their civil war had ended. Beirut was still 50% rubble. I drove through Bosnia only 2 years after the 10 years of the Yugoslav wars. I've never seen such widespread horror. I stood in line in Moscow when the Soviet Union was in its last minutes of its reign of terror and waited for 4 hours to buy 1 box of milk, which had run out by the time I reached the front of the line. Try again tomorrow. I volunteered in the Mosquito Coast in Honduras 7 years after Hurricane Mitch flattened 70% of the country's infrastructure. That's 70%. After that hurricane, world governments and the Red Cross swooped in to get the country back on its feet. But even to this day, many areas there are still reeling. I'm actually speaking to you right now from a makeshift office, evacuating from the recent fires in LA. It's my 3rd evacuation from fires in 30 years. Blessedly, our place is intact, but for thousands, that's not the case. Actually, these few books behind me are what we took in the 10 minutes we had to grab things and run. In those experiences, I have learned that yes, repairs must start from the top. But the only way to truly restore after the bombs are dropped is to start right at the bottom, one by one, with people ready and willing to work long and hard. I learned another invaluable lesson in those travels. America, for all its problems, has the best government on earth. People come and go, the lunatics, the scoundrels, the greats, but the government itself, ours is the best. And to be clear, I do truly love every country I've seen, and that's about 1/4 of the countries in the world. And they have many things to teach us, but how to form a government is certainly not one of them. Our government needs to be involved and create change from the top in education. And somewhat miraculously, it looks like that might be starting. But how long will it take? There are over 4 million teachers in America. Almost all of them were educated after much of the destruction. Their education was severely lacking. And I'm one of them, so I'm not pointing fingers. I'm assessing damage. How are we going to train 4 million highly talented teachers? Who exactly will teach them? How many generations will it take to turn this Titanic? In fact, the solution is right at hand, and the solutions to restore education to its potential glory are exactly the same for restoring faith and family. In a sentence, we've lost our words, and we need to find them. I'll give you an example. Some of the most beautiful words ever spoken by an American were these: duty, honor, country. Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you can be, what you ought to be, what you will be. Those words to know and love were spoken by General Douglas MacArthur in his 1962 speech at West Point. That speech is included in Finding Our Words, and how I hope every American reads it. Those three words, duty, honor, country, don't just apply to the military. They apply to anyone in any role, to mothers, fathers, children. We all have duties, and we should execute them honorably. But we've lost those words. In just one moment, I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by lost. These are some charts from Google. They show word usage in history. It's from 1800 to 2019, but I think just note that 2019 because I think we've lost them even more in the last few years. So there's duty. We've literally lost it. We've stopped saying the word from 1800 to 2019. Honorable, same thing. Patriotism. Diligence. Corrupt. So only two things are possible here. Either one, there's nothing corrupt happening anymore, so we don't need to use the word, or our concept of corrupt has changed, and many things that were considered corrupt just aren't called corrupt anymore, and that's why we don't use the word. Proper, same principle. Chaste. Elocution. Orator. Elocution used to be a class taught to all elementary and middle school, high school students. It hasn't been for about 100 years, and we see the results everywhere, and again, I'm counting myself in the mix. Valor. Valor's trying to make a comeback. Humble. Dignified. Tenacity. Fortitude. Patience looks like it's trying to rally. That's good. So those are the words we've lost. We're still talking. What are we saying? Hook up. Well, maybe that replaced chaste. Bored. That perhaps replaced tenacity. Isolated. Gangster. Maybe that replaced valor. Trafficking. Maybe that replaced duty. Pimp. Druggie. Those terrible charts tell a terrible story, but we are working to fix it. One by one, right here, right now, we can learn from the best and brightest the world has ever known, from the ancient world to America's founders, by simply reading the words that they spoke and wrote specifically for our benefit and pleasure. And oh, how pleasurable it is. I have spent over a decade reading more or less only works from the 19th century and earlier. And generally speaking, we don't need new teachers or schools, and please, oh please, no newfangled ideas. We simply need to read exceptional books, as was always done, until lousy, dry, no one can stand them textbooks took over the schools, and then the lousy textbook disappeared and devices replaced everything, including reading, parenting, and community. My professional background is in the financial industry and in publishing. I built and sold several small businesses in my career. The last business I sold was a company I built with a partner in Germany, publishing English and German editions of a magazine about trading the financial markets. When I started Family Life, I approached the idea of parenthood as I would in building any company. I researched full-time. I found great leaders, meaning great tutors and great books. And that ultimately led to founding Mount Titano Media. The books we publish are single works and compilations of the greatest words ever written, and always include supplemental content to enhance the learning and the joy to be had. In place of outsourcing education entirely, instead of relying on strangers to teach with good materials and to teach it well, the solution we propose is actually easy, inexpensive, and delightful. 1, we read extraordinary books, and then here's the serious key to turning things around. We read extraordinary books together at home, preferably aloud together with our family, with our children. You know how we all despise calling a company's customer service line and only reaching call centers where the person on the other end can't understand us, we don't understand them, and despite both parties' patience and valiant attempts, there's no communication? A little outsourcing can be beneficial, but complete outsourcing doesn't work for any company, so why are we doing it with our children's lives and futures? Outside school can and should be excellent. I'm already partnering with some excellent schools and look forward to working with schools across the country. But we can't entirely outsource education, and every good school and every good teacher would agree. One might argue, though, not one more thing on the list. We're already too busy. We have no time. I understand. A lot of us are just trying to get through the day, harried and somehow having eaten something by the end of it. First, I believe we can find ample time to read if we turn off the devices. If we can do that for 15 minutes a day for our family, that's a huge step in the right direction. And we've also taken time constraints into consideration in our books. No book should teach just one subject. Maybe just one subject explicitly, but implicitly there should be layers of learning. For example, a book on the Roman Republic could contain a dry, uninspired presentation of the facts, and we could call that a textbook. But for starters, how grim to take a fascinating subject and present it so everyone dreads it. In our books, take Finding Our Words, for example, all of the writing is exemplary. It's fantastic. And everyone who reads it and reports back of getting chills and even crying while reading it. And that is what almost any well-written book can do. They move us, they inspire us. And further, again talking about Finding Our Words, that book is an excellent standalone for teaching U.S. history, but also a supplemental work for the study of statesmanship, government, oratory, composition, civic virtues, ethics, vocabulary, spelling, and to a smaller degree, even art and geography. Decades of studying the insignificant, the fleeting, and worst, the dull, accomplishes very little and wastes a fortune in time and money. It stunts otherwise great minds. Why, oh why, would we keep doing it? At Mount Titano, we design our books so they offer significant returns with even the smallest investment, and they are a joy to read. Thus far, I've discussed Finding Our Words. Mount Titano has numerous books in the timeline, with 6 scheduled for release in the next 18 to 24 months. The next release this April is titled Heroines of History. Talk about destruction. Our poor children. Who are the role models held up for boys and girls in our sad, broken society? Our book, Heroines of History, is one answer to that situation. Dr. Lessard of Adeodatus says of this book, "Our young men and women, as well as their parents, stand in great need of these kinds of stories for their education and formation." Yes, we do. And that is where you come in. I would like to partner with you for distribution, to create classes around these books, and I would certainly enjoy participating and helping in your events. We are already working with distributors. Memoria Press, the publisher and online school that my daughter and I have grown to love in the years of learning with them, and with Dr. Lessard of Adeodatus. If you have any questions, I look forward to learning about your efforts and determining what we can do together. In the meantime, why not tell everyone you know about the book to read for America's fast approaching 250th anniversary? 3 of the speeches in the book are Independence Day speeches, one by John Quincy Adams in 1837, one by Frederick Douglass in 1852, and one by Calvin Coolidge in 1926 that he gave for our 150th anniversary. Coolidge said in his speech, "The American Revolution represented the informed and mature convictions of a great mass of independent, liberty-loving, God-fearing people who knew their rights and possessed the courage to dare to maintain them." Let's read these fine words with our families and count ourselves among them.